Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers. So what's new and exciting this week in your world, Ant?
Well, the news this week, James, is big numbers. Social Security spending topped $1 trillion in this last fiscal year. If the Social Security program were a country, it would be the 16th largest on the planet. The Social Security program alone spends twice as much each year as the entire economy of Sweden. And in total, we spend about twice as much on the Social Security program as we do on the entire U.S. military.
Well, lucky for us, the Social Security program is very well funded and everything's working appropriately. We'll probably hit that a little later in the show.
In other news, Saudi Arabia granted citizenship to a humanoid robot produced by Hanson Robotics. The robot, named Sophia, gained notoriety back in March of 2016 when, during a live demonstration, it said, and I quote, "I will destroy humans."
This ought to end really well.
During the interview in which it was granted citizenship, the robot spoke with all the poise of a drunkard, talking over the interviewer, appearing not to hear what was said, and not entirely grasping the meaning of what it did hear. It behaved more like a cross between a department store mannequin and the Echo Dot. However, for those eagerly anticipating our robot overlords, Masayoshi Son, the CEO of SoftBank, anticipates that in 30 years, artificial intelligences will attain IQs of 10,000. And if we start granting them citizenship, I expect that robot voters will drive us either toward a libertarian paradise or a totalitarian hellhole, which might just be one more option than current voters are driving us toward.
Yeah, that all sounds great. But in the here and now, Ant, the 2020 presidential race has already, I think, pretty much begun. And we've got two pretty solid indicators here. Joe Biden came around a couple of days ago and declared, and here's this exact quote, so try to pay attention, "I'm not going to decide not to run."
I'm not going to decide not to run.
Right, which calls to mind Homer Simpson back in the classic Simpsons episode Missionary Impossible, who told Lisa, "I'm not licking toads." So we've got Joe Biden, who is not going to decide not to run. And his counterpart, I think, in the grand scheme of things on the Republican side is Arizona Senator Jeff Flake, who just made a big show of quitting the United States Senate, saying he will not seek re-election in 2018, and calling out his own party's behavior and that of his president's. Pretty clear what he's planning to do next. Now, whether he gets any traction or not, who knows? But we've got two pretty high-profile guys already starting to angle for their party's nominations in the upcoming presidential race, which comes in only 3 years.
Oh, joy. We've got 3 years to deal with this.
Yep, the silly season's going to go on forever. Speaking of silly, we're back to marijuana in no small part because a recent Gallup poll shows, finally, that a majority of Americans support legalization. And that's not the headline. The headline is that a majority of Republican voters favor legalization for the first time.
And yet we have an attorney general who's doubling down on throwing people in jail.
Yeah, no, that's right. It's 52% of Republican Party members right now who are in favor of legalization. But Attorney General Jeff Sessions says, you might remember, good people don't smoke marijuana. And even today, he's out with more foolishness about marijuana being a gateway drug, proving without doubt that the Attorney General of the United States doesn't care a lick about evidence.
Right.
Evidence doesn't matter to the Attorney General. But, good people might not smoke marijuana. He didn't address whether perhaps good people like edibles. So we'll leave that open as a pregnant possibility for us to get to sometime down the road. The foolishness of the week, oddly enough, that wasn't it. The foolishness of the week comes from those wingnuts over at salon.com who seem to be bending over backwards to get crazier with each passing week. This week, they contended that Bernie Sanders has, quote, betrayed the Democratic Party by choosing to run once again as an independent in his upcoming Senate run. Think about that.
He was an independent before.
He was, but Bernie Sanders, this is a very odd view of what betrayal actually is, given how the Democrats stacked the deck against him in favor of Hillary Clinton when he did run for president. To even think that anything Bernie could do now would be a betrayal of the Democratic Party, it's befuddling how we could get here. But I guess common sense, decency, and politics have never really been bedfellows. So we'll just see how all this plays out. For my part, I'm more fascinated to see how Salon.com will one-up this next week. I'm sure they will.
They give us lots of fodder for foolishness of the week.
Yeah, that they do. It's hard to ignore sometimes. Also hard to ignore, at least for us, maybe not for everybody else in the political class in the United States of America, is something that we celebrated. Is celebrated the right word? Probably not, but we'll figure out the right word later. We celebrated this a couple of days ago, October 24th, if memory serves. It's Deficit Day.
Deficit Day again.
It's Deficit Day again. It's a measure that you and I came up with, 4 or 5 years ago?
Right.
To try to give an indication that people could understand of what the deficit actually is. So maybe you could take a couple of seconds and just tell us what Deficit Day is.
We thought about this because people would quote a lot Tax Freedom Day, which is the day that you're done paying your taxes for the year. And we thought, well, this would be an interesting way to do a similar thing with the deficit to help people understand it. So the story goes like this. Imagine that on January 1st, the federal government received in one lump sum all the money that it's going to spend for the entire year. And then it starts spending, and it spends the same amount day after day, whatever that is. At some point, it runs out of money. Now, if we have a balanced budget, it runs out of money on December 31st, just in time for the next year's bunch of money to fall in its lap. But if you run a deficit, you run out of money before you get to the end of the year. And that's Deficit Day. From that day forward, every dollar the federal government spends goes on the government's credit card.
All right, so this year, Deficit Day fell on October 24th, which leaves all of November, all of December, and a week of October, so about 9 weeks or so of deficit spending.
Right.
How does that stack up against previous years? I mean, are we running late? Is it early? Are we doing better? Are we doing worse?
It's actually kind of on par for the past maybe 20, 30 years. Deficit days have generally fallen in the late October, early November range. During the Great Recession, those years, 2008, 2009, 2010, Deficit Day was falling all the way back in early August. But generally speaking, we're talking about October, November. Another exception was during the Clinton years when Bill Clinton got almost to the end of December back in 2006.
And let's take a very quick second here and address the Clinton years, because Clinton supporters will scream from the rooftops that he, in fact, balanced the budget.
Right.
But what you're saying now indicates that, in fact, he didn't, that it was maybe nearly balanced, but not quite. So what's actually going on during those years with the math?
This is kind of interesting. You know, it's just a financial melee anytime you try and look into the federal government's numbers. If the federal government were a corporation, there'd be lots of people in jail for financial fraud right now. But what happens if you look at the federal government numbers? You actually come up with two different numbers for the deficit. One is the official deficit that they say. The other is the change in the debt. Now, the debt is not an easy thing to hide, right? You can't do lots of accounting tomfoolery to make those numbers be what you want them to be. They're kind of set in stone. So what happens is if you look at the change in the debt from one year to the next, that should equal exactly to the penny the deficit. But it doesn't, and that's what happens back in the Clinton years. Officially speaking, if you look at the official deficit numbers, you see surpluses during several of the Clinton years. However, in those same years, year after year, the federal debt rises. That is, the debt is getting worse and worse, which should not be the case if you really do have surpluses.
So where did the surplus come from, Ant?
Yeah, well, this is an interesting thing here, that there are all kinds of things. The word was back during the Clinton years, the federal government decided to count borrowings from the Social Security Trust Fund as revenue, which would be kind of akin to you going to an ATM, taking a cash advance on your credit card, and claiming that you just got a raise. That's kind of weird. There are other things that go on as well. For example, currently, the federal government borrows the money that it makes available to students for student loans, and politicians have decided that they don't need to count that money as debt because, well, we're borrowing this, we, the government, are borrowing this money, but we're investing it in students, so it shouldn't count as debt. Well, if that's true, then all the households in the U.S. can just write off their student loans because none of us are in debt.
Yeah, no, it does get a little fishy for regular people when they start thinking about the word you used earlier is the right one, I think, chicanery. But when we look year over year at the debt total, I mean, there's only so much fudging you can do on that side of the equation. So This year's and last year's are easily compared, and the actual deficit pretty easy to figure out, which brings us to the next point, doesn't it? What was it? Just the last week or so, we were told that this year's deficit was going to be the biggest ever at, try not to read too much into this, Ant, $666 billion.
Right.
And yet when you and I calculated the debt, we didn't come up with that number. We came up with an even bigger number, which is, in fact, the biggest ever, $750 billion.
Right.
So this all depends on how one counts. But how is it that deficit day falls roughly where it always does, yet the deficit this year is bigger in dollar terms than it's ever been? Right? One would expect that if it falls on roughly the same day every year, it's going to be roughly the same size. But this year's dwarfs last year's.
Right, that's correct. But what's going on as well at the same time is that the federal government's revenues, technically called receipts, are rising each year. So although we have the largest deficit in history, what matters for deficit day is how big is that deficit compared to the revenue the federal government's bringing in. And so what you're getting is that the revenues are rising, not enough to completely offset that deficit, but to largely offset it.
All right, so we're going to get back to that sort of thinking in a minute or two, but I just want to throw this out there because as I was thinking about this sort of thing, knowing that we were going to talk about it today, I found out that Goldman Sachs is predicting a $1 trillion deficit by 2020. And this is because of some of the moving parts that we talk about and that you're talking about right now. In this case, Goldman Sachs is referring to hurricane relief on the one hand and tax cuts on the other, the tax cuts that are kind of brutally making their way through the Congress right now. And they say if those things go through and we pay off on the hurricanes the way we said we will, that by 2020, we're looking at $1 trillion in deficit.
Yeah, that's probably right. I trust that number. I've looked at, and you and I have written on this before, the Congressional Budget Office numbers. They come out with projections periodically on the future debt. And if you look back at their projections, the Congressional Budget Office consistently underestimates the debt and by a huge amount. Looking 5 years into the future, on average, Congressional Budget Office underestimates the debt by about 30%.
Yeah, no, that's a whopping number.
Even more so when you figure it's 30% of multi-hundreds of billions of dollars. But currently, as of June 2017, the CBO anticipated 2020 debt to be $775 billion. And if Goldman Sachs is saying $1 trillion, that's roughly speaking on the order of the typical underestimation that we can expect from CBO. So I would guess that Goldman Sachs is spot on.
All right, so all of this sets the stage, at least in part, but really, if you stop and think for a minute, deficit spending and discussion about deficit spending is actually the old normal. This has been the case as long as anyone can remember, and we can actually give you a time. I mean, it's been since the Eisenhower administration that we've been behaving this way. So I literally can't remember. Budget surpluses predate both of us and most of the people living and listening to this podcast right now. Most of us have no recollection ever of a balanced budget.
We think it's a normal thing.
You know, look, if it's been happening since the 1950s, it is a normal thing. So the question to ask is, why is it a normal thing? Why do we seem absolutely destined to run massive deficits? And I think that's a fair thing to say. We seem destined to run massive deficits. And I think here the reasons appear at first to be twofold, but it's kind of the same reason by the time the dust settles. The first reason is, as always, politicians. Let's just blame them. But let's not exactly blame them. Let's take a look at their incentives. And what incentivizes a politician to act?
The voters.
That's right. So it comes back to us one way or the next. But what we end up with is a batch of politicians in Washington, D.C., under pressure from their constituents to give them more and more and more every year while taking less and less or the same amount. Well, that's by its very definition a deficit. But as long as the political class has this incentive, this outcome shouldn't be surprising at all.
They'll use, in addition to just the standard background desire from the voters for give us more stuff and tax us less, You also get politicians using the business cycle to ratchet up government. So when we're in a recession, there'll be arguments for why we have to deficit spend, because the more the government spends, the more we can pull ourselves out of recession. But then when we get into expansion, that extra spending that was supposed to be just to pull us out of recession, well, that's become the new normal. So you don't see a retrenchment during recession. And this is, for as wrong as I think Keynes gets economics, I think he's misrepresented here badly by politicians when they quote John Maynard Keynes and say, well, yes, it's a recession, we need to stimulate the economy, because Keynes' next statement was, when you're in expansion, you then need to cut back on the government spending. And somehow that second sentence never makes it into the political discussion.
Just as no one living now can remember a time when we had a balanced budget, I don't think anyone can remember a time when there was an overall cut in government spending either.
Now, I haven't looked at the data. That would be an interesting thing. I bet you that we haven't had a real cut in government spending possibly since prior to World War I.
Maybe to 1791.
Yeah, right. Well, no, wasn't there was a president, who was it? Madison Jackson, who actually paid off the federal debt? And it was like the only time in our history we've ever had no federal debt?
Yeah, we'll look into all the details on that and get back to everybody sometime down the road. But I want to get to reason what I would call 1B for why we have massive deficits and why we're destined to. It's intimately related to the politician/voter reason, but it's mandatory spending. And most people don't even realize, but we have a class of spending in the United States in the budget that is absolutely mandatory. It must happen. It's not discretionary. There's no way for Congress, without further legislation, to say, okay, we're not spending this year. Every year, this class, mandatory spending, gets spent, and there's an adjustment made to it, and a little more gets added to the pile. But what is mandatory spending, Ant, and how did we get here?
This is interesting because you'll see from time to time these graphs that are passed around on the internet showing this huge chunk of the federal budget that goes to the military. And people get all up in arms about this. But that graph that goes around, that's only discretionary spending. That's actually about 30% of the budget. The lion's share of the budget, 70%, is this mandatory spending. And the lion's share of mandatory spending is Social Security benefits. So the government pays out Social Security benefits to retirees, to widows, to orphans, all of that. It also includes retirement benefits for the military. It includes income assistance for the needy, Medicare payments. But all of that together, plus the interest on the debt, is counted as mandatory spending. And the interesting thing about this is, by law, this is spending that will occur unless Congress takes action to stop it. Whereas discretionary spending, by law, is spending that does not occur unless Congress takes action to institute it. So if Congress sits back and does nothing, mandatory spending keeps rolling right along as it does.
So I guess the real question is, who in Congress has an incentive to cut Social Security?
Oh, yeah, none of them.
No one. Absolutely no one. There's a reason why we call this the third rail of American politics, right? You don't touch it. And everybody knows this, but 70%, now that's a number, isn't it? 70% of the American budget is taken up by mandatory spending, but it's worse than that. Because if I ask you the question, how much of our receipts are gobbled up by mandatory spending, we're going to get a different answer entirely.
Right. So if you look at mandatory spending as a fraction of all the money the federal government brings in, we're at about 85%. So 85 cents of every dollar the government takes in goes to pay for some form of mandatory spending.
All right. Now here's where we play I'm no economist, but. So, Ant, I'm no economist, but. I'm guessing that with all of the trends moving in the directions that they're moving, it's not going to be long before 100% of our receipts are gobbled up by mandatory spending.
The projections all conveniently have mandatory spending topping out at the current level. But if you look backward, you see this very steady, upward, solid track. And if you just extend that solid upward moving track into the future, assuming that the future is going to look just like the past, what you'll find is that mandatory spending will eat up 100% of federal revenues in about 13 years.
And from that point forward, every penny of spending will by definition be deficit spending. Every penny of it, all of it. And if you don't think that's a prescription for disaster, then you don't think anything is a prescription for disaster, because that's a mess waiting to happen. Matter of fact, we already kind of have a mess. And the reason for it, I think, is incredibly simple. And it's something that you and I say every now and again. We probably don't say it enough, and I don't think anybody else says it near enough. But the nature of government spending is at issue here, which means what we want and what politicians want to give us is at issue. And we ask the question, what do we want, all the time, but we never ask the proper question, which would be, what can we afford? And which of those two questions you ask first is going to determine what kind of budget you're looking at second.
Which, interestingly, is exactly backwards from the way real people address these questions. You start off with, what do I have? And then go to, what can I spend?
Right, and notice we have no policy prescriptions here apart from ask the question, what can we afford first, and then live in conformity with whatever the answer is. We're not saying we should spend more on the military or more on social programs. We're saying nothing about the relative breakdown of spending in the country at all. We're just saying that these levels can't be continued. We can't continue down this road.
That's where the devil of the whole thing lives. We've lived this way for so long. The natural reaction to people when you say what you just said is, well, but we've been getting along fine so far. We've been getting along fine like this for the past, 30, 40 years. Why can't it continue? And it can't continue because at some point the money actually runs out.
It literally runs out. And here's what we're up against. The $750 billion deficit this year means literally that we will add $750 billion to our already bulging debt. Now, our debt officially is $20 trillion or so dollars, so we're going to be up to about $21 trillion after this year. But that doesn't really get to the heart of it because mandatory spending. We're right back around to that. So how is it that $20 trillion plus mandatory spending equals a different number?
When you think about the mandatory spending, all of a sudden it puts the debt in a new reality, because if you admit that we've got to spend this money, we've baked it into our legal system, then this money that you've got to pay out itself represents an obligation. In fact, that's the word they use, is obligation. Technically speaking, it's not a debt. Well, the value of that obligation is gargantuan. It's something on the order of $100 trillion. This is how much money the federal government would have to have on hand right now, the principal and interest of which would enable the government to continue making its promised mandatory spending.
So we're not looking at a $20 trillion debt or even a $21 trillion debt. We're looking at somewhere over a $120 trillion debt.
Right. Of course, we don't have $120 trillion, which means at some point, the federal government's going to throw up its hands and say, you know what? We know we promised this money, but there just isn't anything there, and we're going to have to renege on our promises.
Right. So the real question is, what does that look like? Because that doesn't look like a loan shark coming to collect the money. There will be all kinds of nice answers, and there will be programs, and there will be policies, but what does it really mean in the end?
What it really means in the end is that the taxpayers are going to pay for this, and they could pay in several ways. One is through increased inflation. One is through reduced benefits. So the government just says, well, look, here's a bunch of people. I promised you Social Security benefits, but you're actually not going to get any. It could come in the form of higher taxes. It will probably come in the form of a mixture of those three.
Right. All of the above, plus perhaps a default on foreign debt as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's really pushing it, right? I mean, at that point, things have gone completely off the rails. So I don't even want to speculate there. But the three scenarios we just laid out, that's hard enough.
Yeah, no, that's 1929 kind of hard, right? That's Great Depression hard.
Yeah, in a sense it is. I think there's something important to remember here, because it's easy to get bogged down with feeling depressed listening to this. And the important thing to remember is that the economy's infrastructure remains. We have the same workforce, we have the same intelligence, we have the same buildings, the land, machinery, factories. We can continue to produce what we've been producing. this problem is not a real problem, real in the sense of affecting goods and services. It's a financial problem, that all of a sudden there were things that people were anticipating happening in the future a certain way, and now they're not going to happen, and now we've got to readjust our planning.
Right, but we could readjust our planning right now and head a lot of this, if not all of it, off at the pass. The real question is, are we going to do that? So, Ant, on that cheerful note, I throw it to you for the last word.
James, you and I have said before on Words and Numbers and elsewhere in newspapers that the federal government is bankrupt. The only reason everything appears to be humming along as usual is that voters aren't paying attention, and so politicians are taking advantage of the fact by kicking the fiscal can down the road. Our federal government is consistently about 6 years ahead of the economy. Our economy is large enough today to afford the government we had 6 years ago, and it won't be until 2023 that the economy is large enough to afford the government we have right now. Of course, by 2023, our government will be far more expensive than it is today, about 30% or $1.2 trillion more expensive. If we had a balanced budget, deficit day would occur on December 31st. At the stroke of midnight, the federal government would spend the last dollar it collected for the year. The thing is, eventually we're going to have a balanced budget. The big question is whether it will come courtesy of responsible political leaders or whether it will come courtesy of the cold hand of mathematics. But coming it is.
I got my money on math. Just knowing what I know.
Yeah, you can't vote math out of office.
You really can't. And on that happy note, that's all we've got time for this week. So join us next week for yet another installment of Words and Numbers, which will be posted for you at about noon on Wednesday afternoon Eastern Time. Until then, check out all the great content at Fee Online on social media and at fee.org online. And be sure to join us at the Words and Numbers Facebook group, where we continue these discussions and talk about all kinds of other things all week long, too. So have a good week. I'll catch you next week, Ant.
See you next week, James.